Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're looking at a story that gives us this truly staggering contrast. On one hand, you have catastrophic, almost unbelievable human error, and on the other, you have some of the most unprecedented monumental engineering in human history. We're talking, of course, about the Costa Concordia. It was this massive luxury cruise liner that met a tragic end back in 2012, setting the stage for what would actually become the single most complex naval salvage operation ever attempted. Okay, let's dive into this. Because when human ego and just a cascade of terrible decisions sink a literal floating city right off the coast of a small Italian island, you can't exactly just leave it there, right? But removing a wrecked steel leviathan from a really delicate marine ecosystem is a problem so massively complex, it basically required rewriting the entire rulebook of marine engineering. But to really understand the sheer scale of this solution, we first have to understand the scale of the disaster itself.
Section 1. The Floating Palace.
To truly grasp how incredibly difficult raising this ship is going to be later on, we have to establish its baseline size. When the Costa Concordia set sail on January 13, 2012, it had 4,252 people on board. To put that into perspective for you, this ship was significantly larger and carried about 2,000 more passengers than the Titanic. It was quite literally a floating city. It cost $570 million to build, making it the absolute crown jewel of the Concordia class. I mean, passengers had access to 4 large swimming pools, 13 bars, 5 restaurants, this massive fitness center complete with a Turkish bath, and, get this, an actual Formula One racing simulator. It was a complete marvel of modern luxury, which, honestly, makes its sudden demise just a few hours into its voyage that much more shocking. Section 2. Anatomy of a disaster. So just 2.5 hours into what was supposed to be a glamorous 7-day European tour, everything went fundamentally wrong. Ships of this size normally sail a safe 7 to 8 kilometers offshore in deep waters. But Captain Francisco Schettino decided he was going to deviate from the planned route. He wanted to perform what's known in the industry as a sail-by of Giglio Island. Basically, he wanted to bring this massive, glittering ship incredibly close to the island in the dark of night as a spectacle, a tribute to a former senior captain. And this reckless stunt brought the Concordia just 150 meters from the shore, straight into shallow, totally treacherous waters. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens at that incredibly unsafe distance. The immediate consequence was just devastating. The ship violently collided with a rocky underwater reef. The sheer force of that impact tore a massive 70-meter-long wound straight through the steel hull. Seawater instantly rushed in, completely flooding the engine room and submerging the generators in a matter of minutes. What followed was a timeline of absolute chaos and, frankly, denial. The collision happened at 9:45 p.m., but instead of sounding the alarm immediately, Captain Schettino actually told passengers it was merely an electrical failure. At 10:12 p.m., he was actively lying to the Italian Coast Guard, still claiming it was just a simple blackout, even as the massive ship was visibly starting to tilt. It wasn't until 10:33 p.m. that a general emergency alarm was finally raised, and not until 10:54 p.m., over a full hour after the crash, that the order to abandon ship was given. By this time, the ship was already tilted 30 degrees, which made executing a safe evacuation nearly impossible.
Section 3. The Captain's Cowardice.
Now, in moments of extreme crisis, leadership is absolutely everything. But as the ship severely tilted and filled with freezing water, panic totally took over. The captain, Francesco Schettino, completely abandoned his ship at 11:19 p.m., while literally hundreds of people were still trapped aboard. He would later go to court and absurdly claim that he accidentally fell into a lifeboat. Compare that total failure of leadership to someone like Russell Rebello, a waiter from India, who actually gave up his own life jacket to save a passenger and tragically lost his life helping others. Or the ship's other captain who happened to be on board, Roberto Bosio. He stayed behind to coordinate the evacuation. Even the deputy mayor of the tiny island of Giglio jumped into a lifeboat and rowed out to personally pull people from flooded corridors.
So the crucial point is really captured in this infamous phone call that happened at 12:42 a.m. Coast Guard Commander Gregorio De Falco, realizing the captain had literally fled his own sinking ship, furiously ordered Schettino to get back on board and coordinate the rescue. He commanded him to go back and do his duty. And Schettino? He made excuses and refused. He just sat there at a safe distance on the island and watched his ship sink.
The tragic human cost of these delays, these lies, was devastating. 32 people lost their lives that night, and so many of them died simply because they were trapped in submerged cabins. If that alarm had been raised immediately upon impact, before the ship took on that severe tilt, they could have easily escaped.
Section 4. The Ultimate Engineering Challenge.
When the sun finally rose, engineers looked at the rep and declared the colossal ship a constructive total loss. It was never going to sail again. But leaving it there? Absolutely not an option. Before they could even think about moving the ship, though, they had to defuse a massive environmental ticking time bomb. The Concordia was fully loaded for its journey with 1.9 million liters of fuel, and because it was winter, much of this fuel had turned semi-solid, almost like a thick syrup. Engineers couldn't just pump it out. They had to build these huge oil barriers around the ship, pipe in heat to warm the fuel back into a liquid state, and then painstakingly pump it into a separate tanker. That delicate process alone took them over a month to finish. Let's move to see how this builds, because with the fuel safely removed, they could begin the actual salvage. This is a highly complex process known as parbuckling. You obviously can't just crane a ship this massive out of the water. First, engineers spent an entire year building massive underwater steel structures to basically create a flat, artificial seabed. Then they had to figure out a way to physically roll this 114,000-ton vessel upright without it breaking apart and slipping further down the reef. And their brilliant solution relied on these caissons. Think of them as massive, multi-story hollow steel boxes. Engineers permanently welded 15 of these absolute behemoths to the exposed upper side of the sunken hull. By precisely filling these boxes with seawater, they acted as massive controlled weights. Working together with a really complex system of hydraulic jacks and heavy steel cables pulling from the shore, the sheer weight of the water inside these caissons provided the immense torque they needed to slowly roll the ship upright onto those underwater steel platforms. It took a grueling 19 hours of continuous, millimeter-by-millimeter pulling on September 16, 2013, to finally wrench the Concordia upright. But they weren't done. Once it was sitting flat on the platforms, they attached more caissons to the newly exposed side of the ship. Then, by pumping the water out of all the caissons and filling them with air, they essentially turned them into giant flotation devices, giving the wrecked hull just enough buoyancy to finally lift off the platforms.
And this wasn't just some automated machine effort. It was a massive human undertaking. It took 19 months of meticulous preparation and an absolute army of 500 personnel. We're talking elite divers, structural engineers, heavy lift technicians, and marine biologists, all working around the clock. Their incredible efforts finally culminated in July 2014, when the refloated wreck was successfully towed away to the port of Genoa so it could be scrapped.
Section 5. The billion-dollar cleanup. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of the toll it left behind. The physical ship was finally gone, but the financial wreckage was staggering. Remember, the ship originally cost $570 million to build, but just the rescue and salvage operation, that cost a mind-blowing $1.2 billion. When you factor in the scrapping process, compensation of about 1 million rupees to each surviving passenger, and the settlements to the victims' families, the overall disaster cost the parent company roughly $2 billion. It literally cost more than double to clean up the ship than it did to build it. As for the man responsible for it all, justice did eventually catch up with him. In 2017, which ironically was the exact same year the laborious scrapping of his ruined ship was finally completed, Captain Francesco Schettino was found guilty of manslaughter, causing a maritime disaster, and abandoning his ship. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, where he remains today. The Costa Concordia is really a story of extremes, isn't it? On one hand, it showcases how incredibly fast arrogance and a total refusal to admit mistakes can lead to devastating, senseless tragedy. But on the other hand, it shows the absolute heights of human ingenuity, where brilliant engineering can literally raise a sunken giant from the depths of the sea. And I think it leaves us with a really critical question to ponder. We have proven beyond a doubt that we have the technology to fix a billion-dollar, 100,000-ton mistake, but how do we engineer better human leadership to prevent that mistake from happening in the first place? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next